The first thing I heard was the alarm. Not the slow cycling tone they use for dust storms or pressure drops. This was the three-burst pattern, sharp and hard, the one nobody on Redstone ever expected to actually hear in real life. I was halfway through a cold cup of coffee when it hit, and I had my boots laced and my rifle off the wall before the third burst finished. Outside the watchpost, the sky above Redstone was changing color. That is the only way I can describe it. The deep black of space, usually cut clean by two pale moons, had developed a bruise along its eastern edge, a deep spreading violet glow that pulsed like a second heartbeat. I stood there for exactly 2 seconds. Then I started moving. My name is Mira Vasquez. I am a sergeant on the Colonial Defense Watch at Redstone Station, which is a polite way of saying I stand guard over a cluster of domes, tunnels, and dust-covered equipment 12 light-years from the nearest fleet installation. Redstone produces iron ore, compressed silicate panels, and nothing else of note. It sits in a system with no strategic value, no rare minerals worth a war, and no population worth a headline. 847 people live here. We grow our own food, repair our own equipment, and drink terrible coffee that somehow always tastes faintly of the red dust that gets into everything. I had been here for 2 years. I expected to be here for many more. The sky above me was now actively on fire, not fire the way a fuel tank burns, but fire the way a sunrise looks when it is happening too fast and from the wrong direction. Wide columns of light, spaced evenly, descended through the upper atmosphere. I counted them. 7, then 10. Then I stopped counting and started running toward the armory. The colony's main corridor connects the 6 outer domes to the central hub, through a pressurized tunnel roughly 400 meters long. I passed 9 people on that run. None of them were panicking. That is the first thing I want you to understand about Redstone. Nobody panicked. People moved quickly, yes. People looked grim and focused, absolutely. But the particular high-pitched chaos you might expect from a colony of farmers under alien bombardment did not happen. The people I passed were pulling on gear, checking equipment, communicating in short clipped sentences. One man, a big quiet fellow named Gordon Webb who maintained our water reclamation system, was calmly loading a crate of emergency oxygen tanks onto a dolly with the same expression he wore when he was doing routine maintenance. He nodded at me as I ran past. I nodded back. There was nothing else to say. Warden Calloway was already in the armory when I arrived. She is a lean woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that some people confuse for calm but is actually something quite different. She was standing at the central display table, studying a tactical feed, and she did not look up when I came through the door. 7 vessels confirmed in low orbit, she said. 2 more holding at range. Configuration matches Vithara Strike Wing. I had heard of the Vithara. Everybody had. They were an expansionist species from the far side of the Riven Cluster, roughly reptilian in build, highly organized, and possessed of a military doctrine that prioritized speed and overwhelming early force. They had absorbed 4 colony systems in the past 18 months. In each case, the colony had surrendered within hours. In each case, the Vithara had taken what they wanted and left a garrison behind. Have they signaled? I asked. Coming through now, Calloway said. The broadcast was translated by our system in real time. The voice was flat, mechanical, stripped of whatever natural inflection the original speaker had used. The message itself was direct. Redstone Colony was hereby claimed as a resource extraction point under Vithara Expansion Mandate 41. All residents were to gather at the central landing pad within 2 hours. Resistance would be met with force. Compliance would be met with reasonable treatment. The fleet above us had sufficient ordnance to remove every structure on the surface. They preferred not to do so. We had 72 of our standard hours to formally surrender, after which ground forces would begin their operation regardless. The message looped 3 times, then stopped. The armory was quiet for a moment. Then someone behind me, a young man named Colin Barr, who was our best long-range sensor technician, let out a slow breath. Reasonable treatment, he said. Generous of them. Very, Calloway agreed without any particular emotion. She turned to face the room. There were 11 of us present. She looked at each person once, briefly, and then she began to speak in the same tone she used for morning briefings. They have orbital superiority, and we cannot change that. Direct engagement with their fleet is not the objective. The objective is to make the cost of taking this colony so high that it becomes a lesson the Vithara carry back with them. We have the tunnels, we have our equipment, and we have each other. She paused. They are expecting 800 frightened miners. What they are going to find is something else entirely. Nobody cheered. Nobody needed to. People simply began moving to their assigned stations with the quiet efficiency of individuals who have done difficult things before and expect to do them again. I picked up my rifle and checked the charge. Full. I clipped it to my back, took a second sidearm from the rack, and slid 2 extra power cells into my jacket. Then I walked to the window at the far end of the armory and looked out at the sky. The columns of light were still coming down. The bruise on the horizon had spread until it covered nearly a third of the visible sky. I could see the silhouettes of the lead ships now, dark and angular, dropping through the upper cloud layer with the easy confidence of something that has never been seriously threatened. They were large, much larger than I expected. The lead vessel alone looked to be several times the size of any ship in the colonial fleet. I watched them descend. I thought about all the things I had done before I came to Redstone, all the places I had been, and the situations I had come through. And a feeling settled into my chest that was not quite fear and not quite excitement. It was something in between. Something older. They thought they were coming for a colony of miners. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Colin appeared at my shoulder and handed me a fresh cup of coffee from the side station. It was terrible, as always, faintly red with dust, and far too hot. I took it gratefully. Our people are all moving into position? I asked. Every single one, he said. Nobody's heading for the landing pad. Good. I took a long sip of the awful coffee. Outside, one of the Vethara ships swept a search beam across the surface, slow and methodical, like a hand reaching down to check what it was about to grab. They are going to regret this. Colin was quiet for a moment. Then, without any particular drama, he said, yes, they really are. The beam swept past the window. Neither of us moved. The red dust of redstone settled softly against the glass. And somewhere deep in the tunnels below us, 847 people who had already survived things no survey could measure were getting quietly, carefully, and very purposefully ready. The first ground unit came down 4 hours after the initial broadcast. Not 2 hours, not at dawn, not with any of the theatrical timing the Vethara had suggested. 4 hours, in the mid-morning light of Redstone's pale sun, a single landing craft set down on the flat plain half a kilometer north of our central dome. I watched it from a tunnel camera, a small secondary feed routed to my handheld unit. The craft was compact and well-armored, built for rapid deployment over contested terrain. Its landing ramp descended with a hydraulic hiss I could not hear but could somehow imagine, and 20 soldiers filed out in tight formation. They wore body armor in a deep gray-brown, carried weapons I recognized as plasma bolt rifles, and moved in a textbook spread pattern, 4 covering while 2 advanced, rotating forward in short coordinated bursts. Professionally done. Properly trained, very confident. They crossed the plain toward our northern dome and found the main entry door standing open. From my position 2 levels below ground, I watched them stop. An open door when you are expecting resistance is a message. It can mean surrender or it can mean something else entirely. The lead soldier, identifiable by a marking on his shoulder plate, held up a fist. The unit stopped. He studied the open door for several seconds. He made the wrong choice. He sent 2 soldiers forward to check inside. The rest held position. What happened next was not dramatic in the way people expect action to be dramatic. There was no explosion, no sudden burst of light. The 2 soldiers went into the dome. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. The lead soldier signaled his unit to move up, and the remaining 18 soldiers advanced toward the entrance. They were 12 meters from the door when the dome's secondary pressure seals engaged. The door slid shut. The dome went dark. The 2 soldiers inside were now in a completely sealed environment with no power, no lighting, and no communications, because Colin had cut the relay node feeding that section 40 seconds before the landing craft touched down. The lead soldier stopped again. He stood very still. He looked at the sealed dome. He looked at his unit. He looked back at the dome. Then he raised his weapon. Nothing happened, because there was nothing to shoot at. Redstone's northern dome is 2 meters of reinforced composite over a pressure hull rated for micrometeorite strikes. A plasma bolt rifle will heat its surface. It will not breach it. By the time the lead soldier understood that, my colleague Helen Ward was already moving. I have known Helen for 18 months. She came to Redstone 6 months before I did. Before that, she spent 11 years in deep space engineering operations, which sounds unremarkable until you understand that deep space engineering in contested zones means working under fire, in vacuum, with nothing but whatever tools you brought and whatever creativity you had left. Helen is not a large person. She is average height, quietly spoken, and has a habit of tying her hair back so tightly it looks painted on. She is also the most methodical and dangerous person I have ever personally known. While the Vethara unit was focused on the locked dome, Helen and a 3-person team came up through a service hatch 60 meters behind them, moved to the landing craft, and spent 4 minutes doing something to its undercarriage that I will not describe in technical detail. What I will say is that when the lead soldier finally ordered his unit to fall back to the ship, the landing craft did not respond to remote activation. It sat exactly where it was, completely inert, a very expensive paperweight in the red dust. The lead soldier stood next to his dead ship in the pale sunlight of an alien world, and made his second report back to the fleet. I had no way of hearing that report, but I could imagine the conversation. A second unit landed 40 minutes later. This one was 30 soldiers, and they spread wider, moving in two separate flanking columns with a support element keeping observation from the rear. Better. They had clearly been briefed. They knew the first unit had run into something unexpected, and they were adjusting. We adjusted too. Warden Calloway had divided us into cells long before the fleet arrived. Not squads in the military sense, just small groups of 4 to 7 people, each self-contained, each with a specific function and a specific zone, each operating without needing central coordination. The reason for this was simple. If communications were cut, if I was taken down, if Calloway herself was removed from the picture, nothing would stop. Every cell knew what the objective was. Every cell was capable of pursuing it independently. The 2nd Vithara unit pushed into the colony's outer ring and found empty corridors, powered down equipment, abandoned personal spaces. They moved through it all with their weapons up, calling positions back to their commander, finding absolutely nothing to engage. In their training, empty space means clear space. In ours, empty space means you look at the ceiling. Owen Marsh came in from above. Owen is a compact man with large hands and a background in structural maintenance that required, among other things, extensive familiarity with the load-bearing architecture of enclosed habitats. He knows exactly which panels open, which ducts connect to which sections, and which crawl spaces run the full length of a corridor, without anyone on the floor being able to see them. He moved through the ceiling infrastructure of the outer ring for 20 minutes, repositioning the Vithara's own communications relay devices, small portable units they had planted on entry to boost their in-colony signal. Owen did not remove them. He repositioned them, subtly, just enough to degrade their network connectivity by roughly 40%. It does not sound like much, but when a unit's communications degrade mid-operation, the instinct is to assume the enemy is jamming them. That instinct sends soldiers looking for jamming equipment, checking their gear, reporting the issue to command. It pulls attention. It creates doubt. And doubt in an operation that was supposed to be a clean and easy seizure is enormously valuable. By midday, 2 more units had landed. The Vithara now had close to 90 soldiers on the surface, operating in coordinated sweeps, pushing deeper into the colony's connected dome network. Their commander had clearly realized the initial's assessment of Redstone was wrong. The comms I intercepted via Collins' monitoring system were clipped and professional, but there was a texture to them that had not been there at the start. A tightness. They had found things. Not our people, not engagement, but things. Evidence that the colony was organized in ways that did not match the survey profile. Equipment positioned in ways that suggested preparation. Tunnels sealed in a sequence that implied deliberate planning rather than panicked flight. Each small discovery was individually minor. Together, they were beginning to tell a story the Vithara did not have a file for. Late afternoon, the pale sun dropped toward the western ridge and turned the dust in the air a deeper, darker red. 3 of the Vithara's original 21st Unit soldiers were still in the northern dome. The 2 sent in first, who Colin had quietly guided into a pressurized storage section where they were currently locked in but unharmed and sitting in the dark, and the unit leader who had spent the last several hours trying to reach them and failing. He was still out there when I came up from the lower tunnels to check the surface camera feed directly from the watchpost. I could see him on the feed, a small gray-brown figure in the fading light, standing 40 meters from his dead ship, his unit nowhere in visible range because they had been redirected into the inner ring by his commanding officer. He was alone on the plane, and I could see in the set of his shoulders, even through a low-resolution camera, that he understood something had gone badly wrong with this operation. The 72 hours were not up. We had not engaged them directly. We had barely been seen. And yet the Vithara force on the surface of Redstone was already operating with the careful, watchful energy of a unit that no longer felt like it was winning. I drank another cup of dust-flavored coffee. Colin sat beside me at the monitor station and made notes in his log. Below us, deep in the tunnel network, the rest of Redstone's 847 residents were sleeping in shifts, eating field rations, and preparing for the next phase of something that was only just beginning. When Helen came back through the service hatch, she had grease on her hands and an expression on her face that was as close to satisfied as I had ever seen from her. "Second landing craft is also done," she said, washing her hands at the sink. I looked at her. "Already?" They left it unguarded. She dried her hands neatly. That seemed like an oversight on their part. I turned back to the monitor. Out on the plain, the lone Vithara soldier was finally walking back toward the colony entrance, slowly, not with the purposeful stride of a professional executing a mission, but with the careful, measured step of someone who has started to realize they are in a place they do not understand. Good, I thought. That was exactly where we needed them. I have never been much for long explanations. In my experience, People who spend a lot of time explaining things are usually trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. So when Warden Calloway gathered the full cell leadership in the lower hub that evening, she did not give a speech. She pulled up a map, she pointed, she talked. But before she did, she looked at me from across the table and said, "Tell them, Vasquez." So I told them. Redstone is not a normal colonial posting. Most people who live in far system colonies are settlers, resource workers, engineers, scientists. They came out here voluntarily or on standard contracts, pursuing the kind of life that the inner systems could not offer them. Space, independence, a fresh start. Redstone has some of those people. Our agricultural team, our medical staff, our younger technicians, most of them are exactly what a colonial survey would expect to find. But Redstone is also something else. Officially, it does not exist in any public record. The classification sits 3 levels above standard colonial administration, and the reason for it is simple. Redstone is a posting for people the Earth Defense Force no longer knew what to do with. Not criminals, not traitors. People whose records contain entries that cannot be discussed at briefings. Actions taken in circumstances that no one in command wanted to officially acknowledge. Capabilities that made someone senior deeply uncomfortable. People who were too effective in ways that the peacetime military does not have a category for. People who, after long careers doing things that needed doing, were sent somewhere quiet and told to be quiet. I was sent here after an incident on Kepler Station that resulted in the removal of a hostile boarding element from a civilian transport. 17 of them. 4 hours. By myself, the report said the boarding element had been neutralized. The debrief lasted 3 days. At the end of it, my commanding officer looked at me with an expression I had come to recognize over the years, and he told me I was being reassigned to Redstone Colony for an indefinite period, effective immediately. I said, "Yes, sir." I packed my things. I came here. Helen Ward spent 11 years cutting and welding in vacuum under fire. Before that, she was in demolitions. Before that, something she does not discuss, in a unit whose designation I have never heard attached to any official operation, ever. Owen Marsh spent 8 years on structural integrity teams for military installations, not building them, assessing them, finding the weaknesses, reporting back on how they could be entered, disabled, or rendered inoperable by a small team with limited equipment. Gordon Webb, the big quiet man from the water systems, was a combat medic for 12 years before a deployment in the outer reaches changed something in him that could not be changed back. He is the gentlest person on this colony. He is also the most capable person in a crisis that I have ever met in my life. Colin Barr, our sensor technician, was 23. He was also the youngest person ever recruited into the EDF's electronic warfare division. And the reason he was here, there was a matter of jurisdictional disagreement about a Vithara communications satellite that he had, entirely without authorization, disassembled from a distance using nothing but a standard-issue signal terminal and 2 days of uninterrupted focus. And so it went. Down the table, around the room, through all 847 of us. Some had more dangerous histories than others. Some were simply people who had been posted here because they were difficult to manage in conventional settings. Too independent. Too likely to act without waiting for orders. Too good at things that made their superiors nervous. But every single person on Redstone had been somewhere hard. Every single person knew what it meant to operate under pressure with limited resources, against a stronger opponent. The Vithara had run their colonial surveys. They had checked population numbers, infrastructure ratings, proximity to fleet support. They had assigned Redstone a threat level of minimal. They had not looked at who we actually were. Calloway let that settle across the room for a moment. Then she pointed to the map. "Here is what we are going to do," she said. The plan had 3 phases. The first was already underway. Degradation without direct engagement. Disrupting communications, disabling transport, sealing sections, creating confusion without giving the Vithara anything solid to engage or report back. Every hour they spent searching empty tunnels and locked rooms was an hour in which their confidence eroded, and their assumptions about us became less reliable. The second phase was redirection. We were going to move the conflict upward. The Vithara had ships in orbit. Those ships required personnel to operate. Those personnel were not expecting to be engaged because nobody attacks a ship from a colony with no spacecraft. The logic was airtight. It was also, we had decided, entirely exploitable. Helen and a team of 6 had spent the past 36 hours working on something in the lower engineering bay. I will not describe it fully here, except to say that it involved 3 of our heavy ore transport drones, the entire contents of our pressurization equipment locker, and an approach to the problem of reaching orbit without a conventional spacecraft that Helen had described as unconventional but theoretically sound. When I asked her what the probability of success was, she considered the question with great seriousness and then said, "Reasonable." Coming from Helen, reasonable was high praise. The third phase was capture and communication, not destruction, not revenge. We wanted to send a message, and to send it in a way that could not be dismissed or reclassified. If we destroyed the Vithara force completely, the incident would be recorded as an anomaly, a malfunction, a miscalculation. The next fleet that came would come better prepared, and the colony would be gone before anyone in the inner systems heard our name. If we took a portion of the fleet and sent it home intact, crewed by people who had experienced Redstone firsthand, and survived only because we chose to let them survive, the message was different. The message was, we saw you coming, we knew what you were, and we let you go so you could tell the others. That is not a message any military ignores. The plan required precise timing, and it required every person on this rock to do their specific part at the specific moment without hesitation. Calloway did not ask if we were willing. She knew we were. She went through the assignments methodically, section by section, role by role, until every person in the room knew exactly what they were expected to do and when. At the end of the briefing, a woman named Patricia Cross, who was our chief agricultural officer and had, before that, spent 7 years as a forward reconnaissance specialist in deep hostile territory, raised her hand and asked one question. What if the drone transport approach fails, and Helen's team cannot reach the ships? Calloway looked at her steadily. Then we proceed with the surface operation only and accept a longer timeline. Patricia nodded. And if the timeline extends past our supply window, then we tighten our belts and keep going. Calloway folded her arms. We are not leaving this colony. This is our home. They chose it. That is their problem. Nobody spoke after that. People stood, gathered their gear, and moved back to their assigned cells. I walked back through the lower tunnel toward the section where my cell was staged and thought about all the places I had been and all the things I had done to get here, to this specific moment on this specific dust-covered rock at the edge of known space. The Vithara were above us and around us, with overwhelming firepower and the certainty of people who had never been seriously surprised. They had every advantage a conventional assessment could measure. They did not know who they were dealing with. 4 hours later, Helen's team went to work, and the second phase of the plan began. The first indication the Vithara had that something was wrong above ground came when one of their perimeter sensors near the southern landing zone registered an unidentified thermal signature moving upward at high speed. By the time the orbital watch station processed the report and cross-referenced it with the known colonial asset list, the signature had already reached the outer atmosphere. Then 2 more followed it. Then things got complicated for the Vithara in ways their planning documents had not anticipated. By the time I climbed back to the surface watch post and looked up at the night sky over Redstone, the stars above the colony were doing something they had not done the night before. Several of them were moving. One of them was burning. I stood in the cold red dust and watched it happen and felt that feeling again, the one between fear and something else. And I thought about Helen Ward in her pressure suit somewhere up there in the dark, doing what she did with the same expression she wore when she was doing routine maintenance. Perfectly, methodically, and without the smallest suggestion of hesitation. I want to tell you about the next 16 hours the way they actually felt, not the way a report would describe them. They felt like controlled fire. That is the only comparison I have. Not uncontrolled chaos, not blind aggression. Fire that knows exactly where it is going and moves there without anything being able to stop it. Helen's team reached the lead Vithara carrier on the third approach run. The first 2 runs were diversionary, and they worked, pulling the ship's defensive attention toward its upper hull, while the third drone came in low and fast beneath the sensor threshold and made contact with the cargo bay access plate. What happened after that was Helen's work, and Helen's work is not something I can fully describe because I was not there, and she does not over-explain. What I can tell you is that 11 minutes after contact, a cargo bay door on the lead carrier opened from the inside. 6 people in improvised pressure gear went through it. On the surface, the rest of us were running the first phase of the ground operation, which was not what the Vithara expected. They expected us to keep hiding. They had been searching for us for nearly a day and finding only empty rooms and sealed doors and disrupted systems, and their tactical picture had settled into a kind of frustrated patience. They were waiting for us to make a mistake. We made a deliberate one. Owen triggered the pressure release on Dome 4's secondary atmosphere reservoir at exactly the time we had agreed. Not a rupture, not a dangerous event, just a controlled release that sent a loud, sharp pressure wave through the tunnel network and registered on every sensor that Vithara had deployed in the Eastern Ring. It sounded like a structural failure. It looked like a structural failure on their instruments. Within 4 minutes, 2 full Vithara units redirected toward the Eastern Ring to investigate and secure what they believed was a collapsing section. The Eastern Ring is connected to the main tunnel network by 3 access points. By the time the Vithara units entered it, All 3 access points were sealed behind them, and the lighting in the entire section had been cut. I want to be precise here. We did not harm those soldiers in the dark. That was not the objective. The objective was to occupy them, to hold their attention, to remove them from the equation for as long as possible, without creating casualties that would escalate the fleet's response. Calloway had been clear on that point, and I agreed with her. We needed the Vithara to leave carrying a story, not a reason to return with twice the firepower. But occupying trained soldiers in the dark is not a passive thing. It requires active management. It requires someone moving through the adjacent infrastructure, making calculated sounds, triggering minor system alerts, staying always just out of direct engagement. It requires people who are completely comfortable operating in limited visibility in enclosed hostile SPs with well-armed opponents looking very hard for them. Fortunately, that description fit roughly 200 people on Redstone quite accurately. I ran that operation from Tunnel 7 third level with a team of 4. Patricia was on my left, silent and completely settled in a way that I recognized from the very best people I had worked with over the years. A younger man named Elliot Hume was on my right, and despite his 26 years, he moved through the tunnel infrastructure with the kind of physical intelligence that you cannot teach. The 4th member of our team was a woman named Frances Cole, who had said approximately 34 words to me in 18 months of working beside her, and whose competence was so absolute that her silence felt more reassuring than most people's most detailed briefings. We moved through the infrastructure above and around the Vithara units for 3 hours. I will not pretend it was comfortable. Twice I was within 6 meters of a Vithara soldier with nothing between us but a ventilation panel. 3 times I had to hold completely still for intervals that felt much longer than they were while a search beam swept the space adjacent to me. But we were not discovered, not once. Above us, in orbit, the situation on the lead carrier was developing in a way that was not good for the Vithara. I got the relay from Colin at the 2-hour mark. Helen's team had reached the ship's secondary command node, a redundant control center located in the carrier's lower section, and they had done what they went up there to do. They had not fought their way through the ship. They had moved through it, using the maintenance access infrastructure that every large vessel has, and that every crew becomes complacent about over time, and they had arrived at their objective without engaging a single member of the ship's crew. What they did at the secondary command node, I will describe simply. They inserted a software package that Colin had built over the previous 36 hours, which did not destroy the ship's systems but rather introduced a subtle, persistent instability into its navigation and targeting controls. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would read as hostile action on a basic diagnostic, just a constant, low-level interference that would make precise orbital targeting increasingly unreliable over time, and which would take the Vithara's engineering team days to fully diagnose and remove. Then Helen's team came back out the way they had gone in. The Vithara commander, whose name I did not know then and still do not know now, spent most of that night in an increasingly uncomfortable conversation with his tactical staff. I know this because Colin had, at some point in the preceding hours, placed a monitoring relay in the Vithara's main surface communications repeater, and we were receiving a partial audio feed of their internal command traffic. My ability to speak Vithara is basic, and the technical terminologies exceeded my vocabulary in several places. But the emotional content was clear enough. There was frustration. There was confusion. There was increasingly a note of something I can only describe as reluctance, the tone of a commander who is beginning to privately revise his assessment of a situation, but has not yet found a way to formally communicate that revision to his superiors without it looking like failure. I recognized that sound. I had heard it before, from the other side. I knew exactly what it meant. He was starting to understand that this colony was not what it looked like. He did not yet understand the full extent of what it actually was. At the 14-hour mark, 3 things happened in quick succession. The 2 soldiers who had been sealed in the Northern Dome's storage section emerged into the corridor when Gordon Webb opened the door, gave them water and field rations, and directed them to a sealed staging area that was secure but not uncomfortable. They were unharmed. They were also deeply confused about every aspect of what had happened to them, and I suspected that confusion was going to be useful later. The Vithara units locked in the Eastern Ring were released from their enforced darkness in sections, allowed to find their way back to the main corridors without further obstacle. They emerged looking significantly less confident than they had entered. Their unit lead, a tall soldier who I observed on camera as he came out, stood in the corridor for a long moment looking at absolutely nothing, and I could see him processing an experience that did not fit any training scenario he had been given, and Helen's team came back down, all 6 of them through the cargo bay, back to the drone platform and down, intact, functional, completely without visible dramatic effect. Helen's report consisted of 3 sentences. The package was installed. The secondary node was intact. She was going to need a cup of coffee. I gave her mine. We were not finished. The plan's 3rd phase had not yet begun. But in the long dark of the early morning hours, in the tunnels below the red dust of our unremarkable colony at the edge of nowhere, something had shifted. We could all feel it. The Vithara above us and around us were no longer operating with certainty. They were operating with care. And care, from an overwhelming force that expected none in return, is the first sign of something the military minds on both sides of any conflict understand immediately. It is the first sign of respect. We had not fired a single shot. We had not shown our full capability. We had not done the thing they most expected, which was to fight them directly and be defeated directly, and give them a clean ending to their survey operation. Instead, we had done what 847 people with very particular histories do naturally when pressed. We had adapted, and improvised, and remained completely calm in circumstances that were objectively very serious. And we had done it in a way that a conventional colonial survey would never in 1,000 years have predicted. The sun was 2 hours from rising over Redstone when I finally let myself sit down in the watchpost with a fresh cup of terrible coffee and close my eyes for 20 minutes. Around me in the tunnels and the domes and the sealed corridors of our unremarkable colony, the people of Redstone were doing the same. Sleeping in shifts, eating field rations, moving quietly through the darkness with the focused, unhurried energy of individuals who understand that the most important quality in a long operation is not aggression or speed. It is patience, and we had more patience than anyone looking down at us from above could possibly have measured. Dawn came as it always does on Redstone, sideways in red, the light cutting through the dust in the eastern air and painting everything the color of dried rust. I had been awake for 22 hours. I did not feel it. That is the thing about certain kinds of training and certain kinds of experience. They do not eliminate tiredness, but they relocate it to somewhere you do not have to carry it right now. I was standing on the scorched landing pad outside the northern dome when the final sequence began. The Vithara commander made his decision at approximately the 3rd hour of morning. I know this because Colin, still monitoring the command feed, heard the order go out. The commander called a full unit consolidation, pulling all surface teams back to a central staging point near the first landing zone. Simultaneously, he sent a priority signal to the fleet requesting immediate reinforcement. He was not retreating. He was regrouping. He was calling for more ships because the situation on the ground had exceeded the parameters of a standard seizure operation, and he needed additional resources to recalibrate. That was how it would read in his report. What it meant in practice was that he was standing on an alien planet, having lost 2 landing craft, having had 2 units held at 0 productivity for extended periods, having received degraded orbital targeting data that his engineers still could not fully explain, and having found absolutely no evidence that the 847 people his survey said lived here were the kind of people his survey said they were. He was pulling back because he was smart enough to know when a situation had changed. We had been waiting for exactly this moment. Calloway's voice came through on my earpiece. Steady, no preamble, 3rd phase, all cells, execute on schedule. The schedule had been built around this exact moment. The moment of Vithara consolidation, when their surface forces would be concentrated in one zone, and their attention would be divided between managing that consolidation and processing the incoming reinforcement request. Concentrated forces are efficient. They are also, in the right circumstances, much easier to address than dispersed ones. We did not address them with weapons. Gordon Webb's team emerged from 3 separate surface access points around the perimeter of the landing zone, carrying communication equipment, not weapons, equipment. They set up a direct relay connection to the Vithara command frequency in under 4 minutes, something that should not have been possible with colonial-grade hardware, and was possible only because Colin had spent the past day building a crossover bridge from components that individually did not violate any of the communication protocols the Vithara monitored. And then Calloway walked out, just walked out, across the red dust of the landing pad in the early morning light, without any gear except a communication unit and a hand tablet. She walked toward the consolidated Vithara position and stopped 20 meters from their perimeter. The Vithara soldiers raised their weapons, 40 rifles. She looked at them the way she looked at morning briefings. She spoke in standard first, for the relay recording that Colin was capturing, and then the translation system rendered it in Vithara. My name is Warden Lydia Calloway. I am the commanding officer of Redstone Station. I want to speak with your commander. There was a long pause. I watched from the camera feed on my handheld, standing back near the dome entrance with my team, all of us still, waiting. The Vithara commander appeared at the edge of his perimeter. He was shorter than I expected, with the characteristic wide-shouldered build of his species and armor, that bore the markings of genuine field experience. He stood there and looked at Calloway, and then he looked past her. And I think in that moment he was trying to count how many people he could not see. Calloway waited. She was very good at waiting. He came forward. Not all the way, but enough. 10 meters, a conversation distance or close to it. What she said to him in the next 12 minutes, I will tell you as accurately as I can reconstruct it from the recording, stripped of translation artifacts and technical noise. She told him that his operation had failed not because of a tactical error, but because of an intelligence failure. Redstone Station was not what his survey said it was. The residents were not miners and settlers of conventional profile. She did not describe our histories in detail, because she did not need to. She told him to look at what had happened to his operation in the past 24 hours, and derive his own conclusions. She told him that the navigation instability his engineering team was currently working to diagnose in the lead carrier would take approximately 72 hours to fully remove without the specific patch key that Colin could provide in approximately 4 minutes. She told him that his 2 soldiers in the northern dome were unharmed and would be returned immediately upon his acknowledgement of this conversation. She told him that she was prepared to let his entire force leave Redstone intact, ships and personnel, without further interference, under one condition. He asked what the condition was. She said, take an accurate record of this operation back with you, not a revised version, not a classified version, the full record. Share it with your command and with your intelligence services. Let them understand exactly what happened here and why. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the obvious question. Why would she want that? What benefit was there to the colony and the Vethara knowing how this had been done? Calloway looked at him with the expression I had seen her wear exactly twice before. Both times when she was about to say something that was absolutely true, and that she did not need to argue for. Because the next time someone looks at this colony and sees a soft target, she said, we want there to be a file that says otherwise. The commander stood in the red dust and the early morning light and processed that. I watched his posture on the camera feed change very slightly, a subtle shift in the shoulders and the set of his head that I recognized, across species lines, as the physical expression of understanding something you did not expect to understand. He said he would need to verify the navigation patch before he agreed to anything. Calloway turned to the side and said something quiet, and Colin, somewhere in the tunnels below us, sent the patch key to the Vethara carrier's engineering team via the communication relay Gordon's team had established. 17 minutes later, the carrier's engineering team confirmed the instability had resolved. The Vethara commander stood there for a while. Around him, his consolidated units held their positions, rifles still up, watching the empty dome entrances and the red dust and the pale sky, with the careful attention of people who had learned in the past day that this particular landscape was not what it appeared. Then he lowered his weapon, not dramatically, just brought it down one hand to a carry position, and he said in standard, which I had not known he spoke, agreed. The next 4 hours were the quietest of the entire operation. The Vethara consolidated their remaining equipment, retrieved their 2 secured soldiers from the northern dome, where Gordon personally handed them their gear and shook each of their hands once in a gesture that I think confused them greatly, and boarded their 3 remaining functional landing craft. The ones Helen had disabled were left where they sat. He did not ask for them back, and we did not offer. I stood on the landing pad and watched the ships rise, one by one, climbing through the red morning air, diminishing against the pale sky until they were just points of light joining the fleet in orbit above. I watched the orbital configuration on Colin's tablet as the fleet regrouped, and then, in the span of about 8 minutes, began to move, not toward us, away, out past the orbital shell, accelerating toward the translation point where they would jump back to wherever they had come from. They were gone before the sun was fully up. The colony was very quiet after that, not the quiet of tension or the quiet of waiting, but the kind of quiet that comes after something large has passed. I walked back inside through the northern dome entrance, the same door that had been standing open when the Vethara first arrived, and I stood for a moment in the corridor and listened to the sounds of the colony coming back to normal. Distant voices, the hum of systems coming back online. Somewhere deeper in the structure, the sound of someone laughing. Elliot Hume appeared from a side corridor with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to me without a word. I took it gratefully. It tasted of red dust, as it always did. Patricia Cross walked past and said simply, Helen wants to know if we can get the landing craft working again. Thinks the components are worth salvaging. Tell her yes, I said. Tell her to take her time. Gordon Webb came through the main corridor at the head of a small group, checking in on everyone, asking quiet questions, making sure nobody was worse than tired. He stopped when he reached me and looked me over with the professional assessment he applied to everything and everyone, and he said, you should sleep. I will, I said. He nodded and moved on. I went back to the watchpost and sat in the chair that still had my previous coffee cup next to it, now cold. The landing pad cameras showed nothing but red dust and the inert shapes of two Vithara landing craft sitting under the pale sky like oversized paperweights. The orbital feed Colin had kept running showed clear space above Redstone. Nothing in orbit, nothing incoming. I thought about what Calloway had said to the Vithara commander about the file. About wanting there to be a record that said otherwise. The next time someone looks at this colony and sees a soft target, it would work. Not because the Vithara were easily frightened or because this incident had been so devastating in conventional terms. It would work because the record of what had happened here was genuinely unusual. A colony of under 1,000 people, no fleet support, no heavy armament, had refused to surrender, had systematically disrupted a professional military operation for over 24 hours without a single conventional engagement, had reached orbit with homemade equipment and installed a software package in a fleet carrier's secondary command node, and had then walked out in the morning light and offered the invading force a clean exit with a single condition attached. That story would travel. It would be told in briefings and reviewed in intelligence assessments and discussed in the kinds of quiet conversations that shape how military organizations decide which targets are worth the risk. It would make Redstone a place that professional strategists flagged as anomalous, requiring further analysis, not suitable for standard seizure protocols. That was the outcome we had designed for. Not survival for one day, survival permanently. Make yourself into a problem that nobody with a rational cost-benefit calculation wants to revisit. The sun was fully up now, and the dust outside was glowing that deep rust color that I spent 2 years learning to find beautiful. I leaned back in the watchpost chair and closed my eyes. The light through the window was warm on my face. The terrible coffee was in my hand. Below me, 847 people, who had been through places and situations I could not fully catalog between them, were sleeping, or eating, or quietly getting back to the business of maintaining a colony that nobody had asked them to defend and that they had defended anyway. Completely, without hesitation, and without asking anyone for permission. I thought about the Vithara commander somewhere out there in the dark between stars, composing his report. I thought about the people who would read it. I thought about the conversation it would start, and the files it would create, and the long, careful shadow it would cast over every future assessment of this small red rock at the edge of nowhere. I lit a cigarette. The last one. I had been saving it since the fleet first appeared. It tasted like victory. Or at least it tasted like something that would do for now. Outside, Redstone settled back into itself. The dust moved in the low morning wind. The dome stood solid and unremarkable under the pale sky. 2 alien landing craft sat on the plain like monuments to a miscalculation. Somewhere in the tunnels below me, someone was already making breakfast. Life, as it tends to do when given any choice in the matter, continued.